Samukai was one of the first villains we were introduced to within Ninjago. Of course, you can make the argument that the pilot was all about Garmadon, but the thing is that Samukai was much more present than Garmadon himself. But the thing is that he ultimately met his demise during those pilot episodes, and apart from a brief return in Day of the Departed, he has only ever been mentioned in passing after the point of his demise. And honestly, I think this is a massive missed potential, especially when it does come to this character, because there's so much to Samukai that could have been explored, and honestly, he's an extremely interesting villain when you do look into him. And that's what we're going to be exploring today, the missed potential of Samukai, because not only was he the first Ninjago villain, you can tell that a lot of future villains were also inspired off of him, and I do think that is something that a lot of people should appreciate more about this character. So sit back, relax, and let's talk about the failing of Samukai. But here's what we need to establish first. Who is Samukai? The thing is that newer Ninjago fans may not be familiar with him, because trying to watch the episodes where he's most prevalent is very much difficult nowadays, because the pilots aren't easily accessible. LEGO, please do something about that. But anyways, he was initially the ruler and the king of the underworld. He rose to power because he united the armies of the undead and became the ruler in accordance. But eventually speaking, he was overruled by Garmadon, and he eventually became the general of the Skulkin army. Samukai was actually inspired by a character from Star Wars. He was inspired by General Grievous, and honestly, I do think that is very interesting. He was also inspired in a few ways by Goro from Mortal Kombat, but the thing is that for the most part, General Grievous was the blueprint, and you can really see the similarities when you do look into it. Both characters were four-armed generals of their own respective army, and you can even see within the pilots that Samukai has very similar fighting techniques as General Grievous, such as the fact that Samukai and Grievous both rapidly spin their weapons when it's in their hands. Honestly, really cool to actually see. And also, in the end, they both somewhat similarly meet their same fate. They were both deceived by their own masters as part of a larger plot, and were unaware of the fact that they were actually just pawns in someone else's game. I will say though that Samukai does differ from Grievous in one way, which is the fact that Samukai ultimately went to betray Garmadon, whereas Grievous actually never had any intention of doing as such. So it's interesting that they're very similar, but they ultimately had different fates, and their allegiances were the root cause of that. And this is the first thing I feel like that they could have explored when it did come to Samukai. Of course, ultimately, he was going to betray Garmadon, and I do think that was a very fun little bit of plot. But the thing is that before that moment actually happened, he was actually quite cowardly towards Garmadon. There are scenes where he's just trying to simply speak to his master, and he cowers in fear every time Garmadon responds. And I do think that's something that we should have had more of. We should have had more of Samukai actually intending on what he was going to do. And even then, because we knew Garmadon knew what was going to happen, it would be nice to have seen Garmadon actually acknowledge this was going to be the case. I do feel like it was a lot of stuff that was happening off screen that we should have really have seen on screen, because there was a lot of implication between the two of them that we really just did not get. And I do think that is a very big point. It's just, simply put, have these characters expanded on when it did come to their motives. Of course, they only had about 44 minutes to do this, but they definitely could have had at least some scenes in accordance with the idea. Although I do officially want to take the idea one step further, and it does coincide with the next aspect of its missed potential, and that is the fact that Samukai should not have met his demise when he did. The thing is that multiple villains in Ninjago have either survived their respective season, or they may have met their demise, but for the most part, most of these characters are explored. But in the case of Samukai, I'm going to go back to the fact that he just simply didn't have enough time to fully explore what his motives were and what his characteristics were. I do believe he should have survived the pilot, and he should have been some sort of recurring villain throughout the course of the show. We've seen this with multiple characters, and it only ever benefited them. For example, Scales and the rest of the Serpentine. Of course, they had their initial season, and they also had a part in season 2, but then they allowed the Serpentine to stick around, and they have been shown as late as Crystallized. And we got to see them evolve with the show itself, and we got to see them become more good, become more of a new aspect when it does come to Ninjago. Another big one is Klaus. Of course, Klaus had season 4, and he was ultimately meeting his demise within the Cursed Realm, but he escapes, and that led to the Dark Island trilogy. Just another opportunity for much more expansion to actually be given to these characters. It's really interesting that a lot of them do get it, and it definitely feels like Samukai should have gotten it as well. because it would have been really interesting to have seen Samukai actually lead the skeleton army. Of course, after the event of the pilots, we see them once in the first season, and then we barely get to see them again. It feels like Dragon's Rising has been teasing the idea of the Skullkin, but the thing is that for the most part, they've just been left to their own devices. Wouldn't it be really cool if the skeletons did have something in similar vein to the Serpentine? What if they were actually allowed to be a recurring villain in some sort of way, and actually have some sort of aspect of Ninjago that is their own? I do think, again, it does tie back to missed potential, not only for Samukai, but for the Skullkin. But Samukai obviously could have been at the helm of this whole idea that I do have. Honestly, if you ask me to summarize the reason as to why I would like Samukai and the Skullkin army to be recurring villains, it comes down to Samukai, and more specifically the personality that we've been told he has that has just simply never been expanded on. His personality quite literally reads as such. He is a merciless sociopath, incapable of feeling several human emotions such as empathy, compassion, mercy, etc. Described as a brilliant military leader, he resorts to fear in order to keep his armies in line and holds deep grudges towards several of his enemies, as well as an instinctive hatred towards all living beings. You hear that, and you don't really think of Samukai. Imagine if they actually did that within the show. It would have been so interesting. But to finalize this second point of missed potential, Samukai just simply met his fate too quickly, and his personality was not explored as the consequence of it. They could have had him, like I said, as a multi-season background villain, but they just simply never did. And this personality that I just read off to you, which is really interesting, will just forever lay alongside of this character that has just never actually been used. But that, for the most part, is actually Samukai from the pilots, and you may think, well, that is where the video would end, right? That's his missed potential. They never expand on his plot, and they ended him off too quickly. But actually, no. The thing is that he has been mentioned multiple times since the event of the pilots, and of course he had his return in Day of the Departed, and in many different ways, he still continued to have that missed potential. I'm going to home in specifically on Day of the Departed here. For one, I do think it's the biggest other source of contention when it does come to Samukai, and it's also the only instance where he does officially come back. So I am going to lock in on that specific area. But I will say, if you don't want to see me talk more about Day of the Departed, I did actually do a retrospective on it not too long ago. I really like that video, and I do encourage you to give it a watch. But of course, Samukai did return in the case of Day of the Departed, and the thing is that from the start to the finish of his appearance, whilst I am overall happy with it, there are definitely a lot of details and a lot of aspects that I do feel like went kind of wasted. For one, Samukai initially introduces himself as the fearsome master of the axe, and that is a really interesting aspect that I do want to look at, because the thing is that we've never actually seen Samukai use an axe, and honestly, it does just immediately harpen me back to the idea of missed potential. For one, I'm not dissing the fact that he uses daggers, because when we actually do get to see him use them, they are really cool to actually see. It's just, for one, a shame actually, because in Day of the Departed and also in Season 6, when we do see Samukai, he has this really weird looking daggers, and they're not the same ones from the pilots, so clearly they lost the model, and that's a shame because those daggers were really cool. But the thing is that it does show the missed potential, because we're led to believe that Samukai is a master of the axe, but we never actually get to see him use it. Why was that never the case? It honestly implies that there was so much more off screen again that we just never got to see on screen. And again, that goes back to one of my first points about Samukai. Why is it that we're told so much about this character off screen and we never actually got to see it on screen? But to get back on topic, in the very brief moments where we actually get Samukai within this special, we get to see so many moments of him being so fierce and actually so competitive. And it does just remind you of the fact that we never actually got to see this villain. I mean, he is able to single-handedly overthrow Jay. Of course, by this point, Jay was fairly adept at actually taking on villains. He had taken on the likes of Narukon, he had taken on the Overlord, he had taken on all the other villains from all the respective seasons. But Samukai was able to still beat him out. It shows that Samukai clearly has got a skill to him that we just never simply got to see. And of course, he still ends up meeting his demise because of Jay, but that was obviously just because of backup. But again, it just gives you this impression that Samukai was this fearsome warrior, this amazing warrior that just simply never actually got anything more. But I have to say, as again a side note, there's a really interesting moment from Day of the Departed with Samukai that for one does contradict his personality, but does actually display a very different light when it does come to Samukai. The thing is that when he does have Jay overpowered, he remarks to the fact that it is not personal. You know, he says that he just simply wants to return back to life, and he promises Jay that he's actually going to release his parents after he does take Jay's spot in the land of the living. Now for one, you could assume that he's maybe just lying. You could assume that he's just simply telling Jay what he wants to hear, or he's just trying to lower Jay's guard in any way. But the thing is that it comes across weirdly sincere, and he actually has no reason to lie in this moment. So even though Samukai is displayed as this hardened, fearsome warrior, he seems to actually have got some sort of mercy. And again, that could have been really cool to have explored throughout the course of maybe a couple of seasons. But no, we don't get to see that. We just get an offhanded line that just implies something to do with this character. It's just crazy to think that again, we're back to the exact same point. We are told and we are implied things about this character. And of course he returns in Day of the Departed, which clearly means that he has some sort of significance on Ninjago, because of course they only wanted to bring back the main villains. I mean, you could argue there weren't too many villains at this point, but the thing is that they still did have him back. But obviously at the end of the day, it just brings back this overall feeling of Samukai has a lot said about him, but just simply not a lot actually done about him. And I do think that is the biggest overall when it does come to this video, and my point in general about the missed potential or the wasted potential of this character. Because when you truly take a step back and you look at the situation for what it is, we have a character that has been implied to have been one of the most fearsome characters, one of the most fearsome warriors, and one of the most powerful generals we have ever seen within the course of the show. We have had seen multiple times where he has proven the fact that he is a force to be reckoned with, taking on an experienced Jay, taking on an experienced Wu, taking on everything and anything we've ever seen. One of the most intimidating villains as well. He was very scary within the pilots. And the thing is that simply all of these amazing things were shown to us very briefly, but for the most part all of his personality and all of his skills have just been said by words, just simply not through actions. And that comes down to the fact that this character was ultimately meeting their demise way too quickly throughout the course of the show. Everything could have been fixed just simply by giving Samukai the screen time he deserved. I mean, he is literally the cultivator of so many different things within Ninjago. The biggest example of all is the fact that he had 4 arms. Of course, 4 arms is nothing too interesting nowadays, but the thing is that back then it was truly terrifying, and even then Samukai just full stop was terrifying within the course of the pilots. And I just think that is why it's such a missed potential. This was a scary character, and a character that the ninja could have gone back to every once in a while just to demonstrate what they truly were learning. But again, they just never ended up doing that, and that is why Samukai is one of Ninjago's biggest wasted potentials. But what do you think of the character of Samukai? Do you disagree with the points I've made today? Do you think he should have had what he had and that was simply it? I would love to know what the other side of the argument is, because I am genuinely curious, because I just can't see it any other way. I just simply see a character that needed more time but just never got it. But like I said, if you do disagree with me, I would love to have that conversation with you, because I do find it fairly interesting. I'm going to be honest, I technically didn't even talk about everything. I could have also mentioned the fact that Samukai as a Lego minifigure has also had so much wasted potential. That mold was absolutely fantastic, and it was only ever used in 2011. They never brought him back for Day of the Departed, and they never even used him for Legacy. Of course, the parts were retired by that point, but it's also beside the point. The Samukai mold was really cool, and they just never used it. Again, just further proving missed potential, but I digress, because now I do officially want to hand it off to you guys. But thank you very much for watching the video, and I do hope you enjoyed. And if you do have any suggestions on other characters you'd like me to look into, please let me know in the comment section down below. I honestly find it really interesting to see what you guys want to hear about, because I often share the same sentiment. And honestly, looking into characters in this way does give me new appreciations for the characters. I mean, in the case of Samukai, I always liked this character, but this has definitely put a new light on his personality and the true scope of the character, but only amplified my point that he really has got missed potential. But again, that is kind of just where I stand when it does come to him. But if you did enjoy the video, please consider subscribing. I honestly love talking about Ninjago with more people. And if you do want to support the channel any further, which you do not have to, you could always consider becoming a channel member. You could join the legends on screen. And a particular shout out to Grandmaster Sensei 28208. Thank you very much, because you are an eternal legend. But that is about it for today, you guys. And thank you very much for watching. Take care. Okay, bye!